can you specifically respond to the point that Glenn made about the videos?
It's just bullshit. It's literally, I don't know. That's like a guy telling you that, yesterday they saw UFOs making crop circles.
You're an absolute liar, Destiny, or you have no idea what you're talking about. Mike Johnson is the one who released all the videos. How do you not know that?
We can walk through this. We can walk through this. We can walk through this very simply. We can walk through this so simply. It's such an easy and simple thing, okay? So why do we bring up that some police officers let people into the building? There's only one of two possible reasons we bring this up. One is to say that, well, the protesters weren't actually violent because they were let in, but we know that's false because we got video evidence proving otherwise. And the second is if you want to allege a much larger conspiracy, that the police were actually working to allow protesters or rioters into the building, of which there's absolutely no evidence for. Other than that, the only reason... Let me respond. Let me explain the videos. I'm trying to explain it. Other than those two reasons, there is absolutely no reason to reference this video footage. Everybody knows that there were times, even before Mike Johnson and even before Tucker Carlson, we all knew that there was footage of cops leading people in some places around the inside of the Capitol building. People do this with riots all the time. We know that they were understaffed. We know they didn't have enough people to deal with all of the protesters or rioters that were in the building. And we know that lawmakers were being shuffled through the back, trying to make sure that they were in secured areas that protesters weren't. So the idea that it's somehow strange or inconceivable that police officers were leading people into more defensible areas of the building just doesn't make any sense. Like, I could ask very simply, what is the point of saying that there are videos of police officers ushering people or shepherding people into different areas? What's the point of bringing that up? What are you contesting there?
I'll explain it. And this is like, you are the most binary thing I've ever heard. You begin every sentence by proclaiming it is either one or two, and there's no third or fourth or fifth.
Sure, what's 3, 4, 5?
Neither of those two choices is my argument. The reason why it matters is twofold. Number one is it demonstrates that from the start of all of this, the media and Democrats knew that what had happened was nowhere near sufficiently serious in order to present it as some sort of an insurrectionary threat to the United States. That was why the Brian Sicknick lie was important. That was why it was so important to conceal these videos. That's why it took Mike Johnson, the Republicans, taking over the House and being willing to release all the videos, not just the part that was handpicked for us by Adam Schiff and Liz Cheney, to get the real story. The second part is that the reason it's relevant is not because it proves that none of the protesters used violence. I will say, probably for the 8th time, that there were a small number, a minority of people who were at the Capitol and who entered the Capitol who used violence. They used violence against police officers. They attacked police officers with physical force. Some police officers were injured, pretty much like happens in every protest that is turned into a riot. But what it demonstrates is that even though you have to try and reach for this maximum number, 2,000 people who entered the Capitol, the vast majority of them were not part of any premeditated plan to overthrow the U.S. government, as even the FBI's own informants acknowledged to them on that day. And I can read you the New York Times article about that makes very clear that the FBI's informants on the ground were telling them none of this was planned, this all happened spontaneously, and that even though it is true that a small number of people who were present ended up using violence and fighting with police officers or by engaging in property damage to enter the building, the vast majority of them were nonviolent. And that is the reason why only a small percentage of them have been accused of violence. And the reason that matters is it goes to the question of the magnitude or the extent of the actual threat that January 6th posed to the American Republic and to our system of government, which was extremely trivial and minor, both in the context of our own history and how other coups happen in other countries as well.
Okay, so none of this was a response to anything. So, and none of these points even make sense. So the first thing you say is it demonstrates from the start that the media and Democrats knew what happened.
You're the winner. Just get to the point.
You said in the beginning,
you're the winner every minute.
I know that you're scared. I know you're scared of talking about the facts, Glenn. I know you're scared of the facts, but that's okay. Let's follow them. Let's be brave. Let's be brave.
Not the part where you call yourself the winner every 5 seconds.
Let's be brave. Okay. So you said that it demonstrates that the media and the Democrats knew what happened wasn't sufficiently serious. That was the first one you brought up. How does the release of the videos make the event less serious? Was there not a delaying of the certification of the vote? Were there not thousands of people inside the Capitol? Did they not break in to get there?
There weren't thousands of people inside the Capitol. You yourself put the maximum number at 2,000.
What does 1,000 mean, Glenn?
Number of them,
hold on. Maybe English might be your second language. I'm trying to figure out. What does 1,000 mean? Thousands. 2,000 is thousands. There were I'll say 2,000 makes you feel better.
And
so we know that
that's the maximum number. What the videos show is that a at least a significant number of those people did not use violence in order to enter the Capitol. They walked in peacefully and were led
if somebody
in by Capitol Hill
breaks
police officers.
into the building, the people that come in
intent.
afterwards, of course, are coming in peacefully. In any riot situation like that,
Led in by the police. Led in by the police.
The police are not, but the initial entry into the Capitol was a break-in.
Yes, a small percentage of the people on January 6th
but Glenn, what Destiny is trying to say is that the first people who will come in will do the violence, and the rest of the people will just follow them in and won't do all the violence. So the first person will...
It's like saying 1,000 people go in through a broken door and saying, well, only one guy broke down the door. 1,000 people were trespassing through a broken door. Like, do you think the cops that were leading them around the Capitol building?
Do you know how many political protests have involved?
Oh my God, the pivot, the whataboutism.
The
none of them try to prevent the execution of the election. That's why this is a historic event. You admitted as much. Nobody's delayed the certification of a vote like this before, and nobody.
It was delayed by 3 hours. It happened on the same day as it was scheduled to happen.
Wait a second, Glenn, can you go back to the original point which Destiny made, which is that if you've got those 2,000 people in the Capitol, and you said only a couple of hundred people, maybe only 100 people will actually be violent. Destiny said it's only the first 100 people that will go through, they will do the violence, and everyone else will be trespassing. Does that make sense, or what's your thoughts on that?
No, because if that crowd were actually there to overthrow the government of the United States or to prevent a peaceful transition of power, they would not have marched in peacefully to the White House when the police let them in and then marched peacefully out of the Capitol when it was time for them to go, which is exactly what happened. There was no violence even needed to subdue this riot or to put an end to it. What it shows is that the vast majority of people there were peaceful protesters. They were absolutely people who believed that the election was the byproduct of fraud. They wanted their voices to be heard in Congress. They wanted the Congress to exercise what their constitutional right was in the view of many people, which was to hear claims of fraud, which is what happened in 2016 and in 2004 and in 2000. The Congress, including members of Congress, objected to the certification of votes. They most definitely were exercising their constitutional rights to protest the 2020 election based on the view that
they're exercising their constitutional rights.
Yes. Oh, no, I agree with everything he just said. They thought the election was fraud, and so they showed up to try to protest the results of the election. And they did it with violence. Yes, that's called an insurrection. No, when you don't like how an election goes, and you show up to have a riot to try to make it so it doesn't happen, that's an insurrection. Yes.
There were a tiny number of people.
It doesn't matter the number. When you pivot to irrelevant facts like this, there were a tiny number of people. That doesn't matter. It might have been 100. It might have been 2,000 or 5,000. It doesn't matter what the tiny number means.
It does matter. It does matter in terms of the gravity of this threat. And we began the discussion by your conceding that if it were a tiny number of people, like two or three, it would be very difficult to call it an insurrection. So for me,
and yet 500 people was enough to call it the Whiskey Rebellion, even though those 500 men had no chance of taking over the federal government. That was called a whole rebellion, which is more serious than an insurrection. History and legal experts and the Constitution does not agree with you, Glenn. You are on an island.
This idea that you constantly proclaim that everybody agrees with you and nobody agrees with me. In what fucking world are you living in? You're so
even in the U.S. Congress, the majority of people in the Senate voted that it was an insurrection. The majority of them, not a supermajority. So even in the Congress, they agreed with me. Yes.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but the person that you claim led this insurrection and that everybody agrees was an insurrection is currently leading in all presidential polls to be the next president because Americans actually don't see it the way you see it. Another person who doesn't see it the way you see it is Jack Smith, who had the opportunity to charge Donald Trump with insurrection and chose not to. So
that's a good argument. If he's really popular, it can't be an insurrection, I guess.
To put at the beginning of your YouTube video where you're going to be like, everybody agrees with me, you're on an island. As though I'm the only one who makes these arguments. There are millions of people who think what you're saying is bullshit, Destiny. And the fact that you don't know that shows how insulated you are.
Glenn, can we go back straight to the, without the insults, but can we go straight back to the beginning of the debate, which is we started off with trying to define what insurrection meant. I think we lost that way. So, Glenn, you described insurrection as something that has a potential to overthrow
a serious threat to the system of law and order, and to the stability of power in that country. That's what I think an insurrection or a coup is.
Destiny, would you agree with that?
Basically, yeah. Public use of force by a group of people in order to hinder or prevent the execution of the Constitution of the United States. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, okay, so we keep going back to this, but what happened on January 6th? It delayed it for a couple of hours. Was that trying to overthrow democracy? Was that how does that qualify to be an insurrection?
The reason why it qualifies is because, as Glenn accurately pointed out, the reason why the people were there was because they thought the election had been stolen from them. When they were marching down, they were chanting 1776, and they were going down with the idea that Vice President Pence would unilaterally overturn the election that they thought was done fraudulently in order to soft coup Donald Trump back into power as the rightful leader in contravention of what the Congress was supposed to do, which was the certification of the electoral votes. That was Congress's job. They were there on January 6th, specifically that day, because Donald Trump asked them to be there. They went to the Capitol grounds immediately after his speech because Donald Trump told them to go there. They broke into the Capitol building because they thought that they could delay the certification of the vote. And then when they were there, they only left when Donald Trump told them to. And a lot of them had said in much in all of their convictions that they were waiting for his orders to go home, of which his first two tweets weren't. They were encouragement to continue rioting. And they continue to do so even an hour after Donald Trump, the one who's authorized to deploy the National Guard to the Capitol grounds, sat and watched them do it even an hour after finding out that Ashley Babbitt had died. Again, if you want to say that 2 people is an insurrection, not sure, that's fine. But 2,000 is way over wherever either of us would reasonably draw the line.
I think we've gone over sufficiently the amount of people who were actually there engaging in violence of any kind with any kind of an insurrectionary intent, which is I'll be generous and say that 100 or 120 of them were being. But can I just establish a point of agreement, because I've never heard you actually acknowledge that this was true, that in this speech you're trying to depict these people as kind of like mindless zombies who just follow the orders of Donald Trump and do whatever he instructs them to do. Do you agree that, and can you acknowledge that in his speech there was one time and one time only where he addressed the question of whether or not violence should be used at that protest they were going to at the Capitol? And when addressing that on one occasion, he told them to go there and protest peacefully. Is that something you acknowledge is what he told them?
So I would acknowledge that. However, on my YouTube channel, we try to engage in serious political analysis. So when I'm engaging in serious political,
well known for that.
I know, yeah, as are you, I guess. While we're engaged in serious political analysis, when we're looking at what is actually going on or what's in the minds of people, I would never in my entire life imagine cutting one sentence out of an hour-long speech to try to determine what the actual motivation of that speech was. What I would do is I would look at the totality of the speech. It's possible you've never watched it before because you only read Twitter headlines, maybe. I would also look at the actions that happened after of both the protesters and the guy who incited the speech to see, what were the actual intentions of what was going on. In that speech, Donald Trump multiple times made allusions to the fact that our democracy was under threat, that our election had been stolen, that Congress was failing the people to act in how they should, and that Vice President Pence was the last hope of saving our republic, and that if you don't fight like hell, they're going to steal your country from you. So I also know that Donald Trump was informed by the Secret Service that there were people trying to get into the protest or trying to get into his ellipse speech that were literally armed and had guns. The Secret Service said, we can't let them in. Donald Trump said, let them in. They're my friends. I love these people. That's fine. And I also know that after the speech, when Donald Trump told everybody to march to the Capitol, when they were marching peacefully, chanting rebellious slogans. They were saying 1776. They were looking to have a rebellion because, as you said, they thought the election was stolen. When they got there and Vice President Pence didn't unilaterally toss the election, what did they do? They said, hang Pence, hang Pence, hang Pence. Pence himself called Trump to complain about this. Trump didn't check in on him a single time that entire day because he was so upset that Pence wouldn't unilaterally toss the election. So when I look at the totality of the events, am I here to say that because he said march to the protest peacefully, that means that it was peaceful? If that was the case, then as soon as Donald Trump saw violence, you know what he would have done? Donald Trump would have made a phone call and he would have said, Miller, why is the National Guard not there right now? What's going on? My daughter-in-law is talking to me. Everybody, or my daughter's talking to me. My chief of staff is talking to me. My lawyers are talking to me. People from Congress are calling me. Everybody's calling me saying violence happening. Why aren't you guys stopping it? He didn't do that. Instead, what he did was he had a 2-minute conversation with Giuliani, and then Giuliani started ringing up all these congressmen saying, hey, don't you think you guys should delay the vote? Give us 10 days, right? What is that? Capitalizing on violence to circumvent the constitutional transfer of power from one president to the next, also known as an insurrection. It's so clean and it's so easy, and none of the facts that I just gave, by the way, Glenn will not contest a single one of them, even though all of those facts are in the politically partisan J6 committee. How crazy is that?
Tell me when you're done talking, and I will immediately contest.
Glenn, can you particularly respond to
what you said? So,
Glenn, can you respond to those, particularly the 2 points?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very surprised that your incredibly substantive discussion on your YouTube channel led to a conclusion that was the most negative possible about a Republican candidate. That would be completely unpredictable. But I'm going to tell you why, in everything that you just said, we can get back to the question and be able to answer the question of why it is that Jack Smith did not actually charge Donald Trump with doing what you claim he did, which, had he done, would have been a very serious crime, and I think he should have been charged for. The reason is because in what Donald Trump actually said, as opposed to all the secret meaning that you and your Democratic Party community believe he intended to convey through very banal political slogans like "go fight like hell," is the only thing he actually told them was that they should go and march there and be peaceful when they went and protested. And you know what? The vast majority of people who marched to the Capitol did exactly what Donald Trump told them to do, which was to be peaceful. There were let's say 10,000 or 15,000 people outside the Capitol, and you said before they were yelling, which actually is constitutionally permissible and protected. You're actually allowed to yell at politicians when you're angry about what you perceive to be a political injustice. Of those, a small percentage actually entered the Capitol, and of those, a very small number of people used non-fatal violence against police officers, something that we had watched occur for months through the summer and into the fall of 2020, over and over and over and over again, when thousands of Americans were injured as part of a nationwide protest movement that repeatedly ended up engaged with the protesters engaging in violence against the police. This, as I said before, I don't regard the Black Lives Matter movement as an insurrectionary movement. I would never call it a coup. But by every metric, it would be so much easier to make that case about the Black Lives Matter movement than it would be about January 6th, in large part, because the number of people actually involved in trying to use violence was very small. Even the people who used violence were not engaged in even the kind of violence that you often expect, which is, again, pulling out guns, shooting people. There was none of that. That's why nobody died on January 6th except for 4 pro-Trump protesters. So, yes, there was violence on January 6th. Yes, they were there because they believed that the election was stolen. Yes, they ended up delaying this ceremonial ministerial process by a grand total of 2 hours or 2.5 hours. But while it was a riot perpetrated by a small number of people, it never got even close to threatening the levers of power of the United States, the most militarized country on the planet. And that is why it is an absolute joke to try and put it up there with the major historical events of the United States, let alone the kinds of coups or attempted coups that take place all around the world that always involve universes greater levels of violence and threats to the status quo than January 6th did.
Wait, so Destiny, just before you continue, I want to go back to what you said because I think it's really important. You made two specific
Wait, can I ask one quick question and then you can ask my thing? Glenn, if they would have managed to kill one lawmaker, would you call it an insurrection then? They'd killed Nancy Pelosi? Because the government could still continue, everything could still go on, it's fine.
I mean, I would need some context. Was it one rogue guy who found Nancy Pelosi and shot her? Was it a huge group of thousands of people dragging her out and hanging her in the public square while they cheered?
If someone was killed,
I would need the context.
Oh my God. Okay, sorry, what was your question?
Okay, so let's go back.
There have been politicians killed before, assassinated in the United States before, and we didn't call those insurrections.
Because they probably weren't a group of people trying to prevent the lawful execution of power in the United States.
Which is why I said I would need the context of
a group of people like Trump's audience trying to circumvent the legal execution of the Constitution? That's that context? Yeah.
Right, so let's go back to Destiny. You made two points before, and I want to stick on those because actually good points we need to go over. Number one is Trump's full speech, the context of the speech, and what he actually said. And number two is the National Guard. So let's go back to Trump's full speech, which he started on, Glenn, but let's actually continue on that point. So Destiny mentioned that if you look in the context, he was actually inciting people to go there, not just peacefully. Would you agree that makes sense, or what's particularly your thoughts? Do you think he was just telling people to go peacefully and that was it?
Why didn't he tell them to go home when they were unpeaceful?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Why didn't he tell them to go home when they were rioting?
I'm trying to answer, but since you're talking, I can't. The way I interpret a speech is I look at the words that are spoken by the person delivering the speech. And when someone stands up in front of a crowd and says, I want you to be peaceful when you go on this protest that you're about to go on, that the Constitution permits you to go on. I take that seriously as an instruction given to his followers not to go there and use violence. And the attempt to suggest that, as I said before, phrases that politicians use in almost every political speech, like "let's fight like hell" and "let's get our country back," things that Joe Biden said over and over in the 2020 campaign and many times before, that somehow that was like a secret code to go tell those people that what I really want you to do, even though I just told you to be peaceful, is in fact go and use violence, is something that you have to be delusional in order to find. And apparently that is not what the crowd heard, since the vast, vast majority of the people who went to the Capitol, in fact, did not use violence. Only a very small number did.
So then the easy question, wait, on the back of that, just an easy question then. Yeah. If he, first of all, also, no one is saying he's speaking in secret code. Everybody understood, apparently, loud and clear, to go to the White House and protest. That's why thousands of people, or I'm sorry, the Capitol building protest, that's why thousands of people went in. But the question would be, let's say that I grant all of that. Let's say every single thing you just said is true, and Trump really did just want them to peacefully protest. Why is it that when the rioting had started and people went to him begging him, please, Trump, please tweet and tell these people to go home, why would he not do it?
Well, he did do it. Your argument
after
is that
hours. No, don't lie, Glenn. Why are you lying? Why are you lying right now?
Can you shut up and let me answer your
question? You're lying. Okay, go ahead. You can lie. Go ahead.
Just let him respond and then respond afterwards.
I think you've lied probably 100 times, but
really,
instead
name
of calling
one.
You a liar, what I try and do is go instead.
What have I lied about?
Demonstrate what the actual arguments are, because I don't feel a need to constantly declare myself the winner.
To be clear, you haven't contested a single fact I've given because I've been correct on everything.
The reason that I believe that Donald Trump delayed telling those people to go home is because for a long time he saw it as a legitimate protest, including people going into the Capitol. So if this entire case now rests on the fact that Donald Trump should have posted a tweet an hour earlier than he should have, and that way the riot would have dispersed after 2 hours rather than 3 hours, I think that illustrates the triviality on which we're actually having this discussion. These kind of reaches to try and say that the reason this was an insurrection and Trump tried to overthrow the government or seize power illegally is because he tweeted an hour after you think that he should have tweeted. That is, I mean, we're talking about the smallest details, because that's all you have.
You're mistaken. You're mistaken. When you say that it illustrates the triviality, that's not true. What it illustrates is how childlike Trump is, that our only expectation would be to pray for him to tweet to send his followers home. What his actual constitution, hours after the rioting had carried on. Donald Trump is the head of the National Guard that ought to have been deployed to D.C., and he failed to uphold in his duty to do that. Instead, he sat and he watched and he prioritized his own political career by telling Giuliani to make phone calls to congressmen instead of executing his duty as the commander-in-chief to deploy the National Guard to D.C. for hours. So you are right in one sense that begging for a tweet is a bit trivial, but what it really trivializes is Donald Trump's competency and the expectations of him even as a president. Because you're right, a tweet would have been trivial and it wouldn't have been enough. He should have taken charge as the president, and 20 or 30 minutes after violence happened, he should have called in the National Guard to stop it. He sat there for an hour after Ashley Babbitt died and watched it rage on before he finally made the tweet telling people to go home. How is that at all compatible with the president that wanted to be peaceful?
I have a question for you. So I don't mind arguments that Donald Trump should have been faster in deploying the National Guard or dispersing the riots, and the riot would have only been 90 minutes or instead of 3 hours. But let me ask you this question. If, in fact, Donald Trump were trying to lead a coup and an insurrection in the United States, why did he go at all onto Twitter and tell those people to leave peacefully? Why didn't he go and say, you know what, we're currently seizing control of a corrupt government, and therefore I want even more of you to come to Washington and go join these patriots in engaging in violence? Why did he call it off? Why did he tell them for the third time or the second time that day, don't use violence, be peaceful, and go home? That does not sound to me like the kind of statement that somebody intent on a coup would actually be issuing. I've never heard of a perpetrator of a coup before telling the crowd beforehand to be peaceful and then telling them 2.5 hours later again to go home and be peaceful.
It's because he knew he didn't have the support for it. It's so obvious. Because Donald Trump doesn't want to actually be caught in the middle of military conflict. He was looking for an easy win, and he didn't get it. And as he saw that his supporters were failing, eventually, he kind of encouraged them when people were begging, please, tell him to go home. And then he starts tweeting out how Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done instead of telling him to go home. When it looked obvious that his little attempt had failed, he's not going to go out there with an AK-47 and start fighting with his supporters. And he doesn't want to leave obvious, clear evidence on Twitter. Guys, go coup the government. So of course he speaks, a little bit out of both sides of his mouth, and he eventually tells people to go home because he failed. It's so obvious, such an obvious reading of the facts.
But he ended up doing exactly the thing that you said a real leader would have done. Your argument is that he did it like an hour late.
No, why do you keep saying 1 hour late? It was like 3 hours after the protest, the rioting had started, and that's a long time when he's getting, and it's also not just that he waited that time period, it's that when congressional leadership and congressional people were calling him and his family, he was making fun of them. What was it? I think it was even McCarthy that made the phone call where he was like, hey, what's going on with your followers out here? And Trump was like, looks like they're a little bit more mad about the rigged election than you are. Like, holy shit. Like, these are insane statements to be making, when instead Donald Trump should be saying, hold on, let me get the National Guard over there. As the guy that's literally in charge of it, it's pretty crazy what's happening right now. I have been tasked as part of my oath to the Constitution.
It's just so far removed from like what any country would ever describe as a coup, what any historian would describe as a coup.
Well, hold on, wait. You're wrong. Hold on. To be clear, I don't care about any other country. I care about the United States. This is my country. And insofar as what a historian would call a coup or a rebellion, again, you are on an island there. You don't think the Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion. Not enough people died. You don't think that Fort Sumter would have been an insurrection without the Civil War after it. It's only retrospectively, determined. And also, you think that Donald Trump was an insurrection because he was in charge with insurrection, even though nobody from the Civil War was charged with insurrection. Glenn, you are completely on your own legally here with nobody in your corner.
Again, this is what you do. You're alone. Nobody agrees with you.
Talk about the number of people who were violent again, Glenn. Go ahead.
I'm going to let my statements speak for themselves about what I said about Fort Sumter and your imaginary Fort Sumter that you wanted me to analyze, and all the other things I said. What you just said, I believe, is a complete distortion of what I actually said, but I'm not interested in bickering about that since there's a videotape that everybody can watch and see what I actually said. Yes, the reason why we look at other countries, I don't know if you know this or not, but the State Department calls what happens in other countries all the time coups and insurrections. They condemn coups and insurrections. Under the law, we punish and impose sanctions whenever a government enters in a way that we call a coup or an insurrection. So we have created a long history of how this term is actually used. And this is what I was saying at the start of our discussion, which is that if all you want to do is have history begin with 2016 and Donald Trump and only look at the United States and partisan politics, then you will end up definitely catastrophizing everything associated with Trump. That's basically what the media has done for the last 7 years, is trying to pick Donald Trump as a never-before-seen evil. The reality, though, is that there is a long history, which I think is critical to consult with and resort to, about how these words have always been used independent of Trump and prior to Trump, including by the American government that you're a part of, or that is your government because you're an American. There's a long record of how we use these terms, and there is no case in which we would resort to trivialities like the leader waited an hour too long to tell people to go home, or there was a protest that turned into a riot that delayed the certification of an election by 3 whole hours. And now we're going to impose sanctions on countries because we believe that there was some kind of an insurrectionary attempt that was serious in nature. Yes, if you just look at everything in isolation and say, as long as I can prove that some people on January 6th did something bad, which is that framework at the beginning, you tried to create this binary framework, then it means that I win. Then, yeah, I agree. You can definitely prove that there were people who did bad things on January 6th. But when you look at it in the context, this context that you insist should be ignored, of historically how we've used these terms, both in our own history and in the history of other countries, it is a joke to try and apply those terms to this 3-hour riot.
Well, so Glenn, let me ask you a question about that. So about the 3 hours, about waiting 3 hours to do the votes. They did it 3 hours later. So instead of a full insurrection, is that at least, could you say that's an attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power?
No, I think it would be a preposterous statement to draw from that conclusion. I think if Trump didn't walk out of the White House peacefully, as he did on January 20th, and had in the interim tried to incite or encourage more violence on the part of the people in the government and in the military who were loyal to him to engage in violence in a way that he really actually tried to stay in power, then I would be more open, more amenable to the idea that this was actually an attempted coup or an insurrection. The fact that political protests delay important proceedings all the time. That's, in fact, one of the purposes of political protests is to be disruptive, to make the people in the government understand that there are people in the citizenry who are angry about a perceived injustice. That is often the goal of political protest. And if the goal of this protest was to delay by a couple of hours a certification that is ministerial in nature and that happened on the exact day the Constitution requires it to happen, if that's all we're arguing about, then to me it settles the whole case. That
what was the goal of the protesters?
A complete joke.
What were they there to protest?
To make themselves heard. I believe they were there to
make themselves heard about what? What were they there to make themselves heard about?
About the fact that they believed that Donald Trump was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election and that Joe Biden and the Democrats had engaged in fraud in the election in order to win that election.
So they didn't believe in the So they didn't believe in the outcome of the election. They showed up to protest the outcome of the election.
Correct.
Violence was used, and they delayed the certification of the vote. Right? Do you disagree with any of those facts? All of those happened.
I do not. No.
Okay, which one of those four? Okay, we'll go over them again. Okay, you agree that they were protesting the results of the election?
I just said I don't agree. I don't disagree.
He said he agreed with all of them.
You agree with all four of those facts? Then what part of this is not an insurrection? What's missing?
The fact that the number of people who engage in violence and the way they engage in violence was very similar to how protests often turn into a riot. It is universes away from any kind of actual serious threat.
I agree.
To the power of the United States.
We agree that this was a riot. No one is denying this was a riot.
Right?
Yes.
It was a riot.
Yes,
Whenever
it was a riot.
bring in violence into the political system, and one of the protesters, an unarmed protester, ends up dead, and police officers end up injured, it's a lamentable act. It's something we don't want to encourage. It's a bad thing. But this is so much to me like the inability to say that a foreign government or a foreign leader is doing bad things without Ahmed immediately calling them Adolf Hitler, and not understanding that there's a difference between a bad event or a bad person or a bad act and what the Nazis did. Like everything has to go to the furthest extreme.
No one is taking anything to a further extreme.
Was a bad, violent riot.
It was a riot. It was a riot.
Nowhere near
it was a riot.
Undermining or subverting the law, the system of law and order in the United States.
It did undermine it.
Intended to do so.
It did undermine it.
To do that.
It was intended to. You said it. You said they went there to protest the election results. It turned into a riot, and they delayed the certification of the vote.
By a couple of hours.
It doesn't matter. They still did it. That was the goal. That's what they did. They weren't that successful. That's not an argument that it wasn't an insurrection.
If you think that was the goal, then I think your argument is even weaker than I thought so the first time. If you believe their goal was to delay this ministerial act by Congress to make it happen at 4:30 p.m. instead of 1:30 p.m. or whenever it was scheduled.
Well, no, the goal was to delay it completely.
They intended to do, and that is what they succeeded in doing. Then the idea that was an insurrectionary intent to delay a ministerial act, a ceremonious act by a couple of hours so that they could have their grievances heard, then I think it's even a weaker case than I thought having listened to you for 3 hours the first time.
Okay, and that's fine. But historically, whether we're talking the Whiskey Rebellion, which used to be called the Whiskey Insurrection, whether we're talking about Shays Rebellion, whether we're talking about Nat Turner's Rebellion, whether we're talking about any of the insurrections that were protesting and insurrecting against the Fugitive Slave Act, whether you're talking about literally any of these things that were historically all understood to be insurrections that Congress was talking about in the 50s and 60s where they passed the 14th Amendment. These were all understood to be insurrections. They were all.
Were those coups?
We're not talking about a coup right now. We're talking about an insurrection, aren't we? Who's talking about a coup?
Coup is a word that we've been using from the very first second that we started talking.
I'm sorry. I believe that in the beginning of this, Eli. I'm sorry. Pull the tape. Were we talking about defining an insurrection or a coup?
No, it's an insurrection.
I asked you for both. I started.
We haven't even gotten to coup yet. We can get to coup. If you want to get to coup, the electoral slates. That's a way easier argument for me. Okay, but if you're having trouble with this argument,
that's certainly something I've been talking about quite a bit, and I've used the word coup many times. But
of course, because you're trying to obfuscate.
It's totally fine. So let me ask you, do you think what happened on January 6th rose to the level of an attempted coup?
Firstly, I would say that, just to reiterate in the past, your understanding of insurrection is unique and ahistorical. Just to be
clear.
clear.
Stop saying that because it's so untrue and it's so irrelevant. Even if I were the only one who thinks it, it's not proof that I'm wrong. The idea that
I didn't
I'm
say
the
it was
only one who
proof.
thinks
I
that
didn't say it's proof that you're wrong.
Agrees with you
I'm not saying it's proof that
ridiculous.
you're wrong.
Not
I'm just
everyone
saying
on your side. Not everyone is on your side, Destiny. Even though I know you sit on a YouTube channel with Democrats and people who tell you that you are. There's a much bigger world than your YouTube channel.
Go back to the actual point. Go back to the actual point.
So the coup part, if I were to look at coup, or call it a self-coup, I guess, since Trump was still in power, the coup part is going to be Donald Trump on 2 or 3 different forks. One is going to be trying to bully at least 7 different state legislatures or electoral bodies to change the results of their electoral votes, knowingly that he was working with false evidence, because every single person that he entrusted to gather data about voter fraud had told him prior to the statements he made about these things that the voter fraud wasn't real. That would be the first part. The second part...
Can you just answer first? Is what happened on January 6th an attempted coup? I realize there's other things.
This is the I'm getting it. This is the culmination. The second part is the electoral slates scheme, where Donald Trump and his people basically contacted 7 different states and got all these people involved in making and testifying to falsely being electors of these states to be sent to Congress, and then I guess the climax of that would have been in Congress, Donald Trump asking Pence, when he gets these fake slates of electors, to ignore the real electors, say that these particular electors, it's too hard to figure out what's going on, and then throw it to the House to have the House essentially, because the Republicans were controlling the parts of the House they needed basically in order to elect Donald Trump as the president, for them to make a determination on the election. That part was an attempted self-coup, yes, because he was yes.
So you do think your argument is also that it's an attempted coup, not just an insurrection. I don't know why you got so
because the self-coup part. I'm explaining because the coup part is fundamentally separate from the insurrection part. There were 2 different things going on that day.
All right, let me because I think it's a good point to kind of like summarize. We've been going almost 2 hours, which is like what we said was our kind of target goal. But so let me just tell you about all of that. My view of what all those events are, which is that as has happened before in elections, in American elections, when people perceived or believed that there was fraud in the election and the illegitimate winner was certified and the legitimate winner was declared the loser, as has happened previously, Trump exercised all of his legal recourses. He was the leader of the executive branch, and he went to the 2 other branches of government, first to the courts, and then when that failed, to the Congress, using a theory that some lawyers had told him, and I don't mean like personal injury lawyers that he picked for that reason. I mean lawyers who had previously been regarded as some of the most prominent and prestigious lawyers, like Rudy Giuliani, not by me, but by many people, celebrated for many years, and John Eastman, people like that, had told him that this was a role the vice president had had. There was an incident in 1960, albeit different, that could have suggested that that was part of the vice president's duty. He went to Congress in order to appeal to the legislative power. And when that failed, when he exercised all of his legal options in the judiciary and failed, and then exercised his recourse in the Congress and failed, he walked out of the White House on January 20th before noon peacefully and turned over peacefully the levers of power to the certified winner of the 2020 election, which was Joe Biden.
Real quick, just on that explanation, what happened in 1960 that was comparable to this event?
There was a dispute about which candidate had won Hawaii, whether it was Richard Nixon or John Kennedy. First, Richard Nixon was declared the winner. Then John Kennedy, on a recount, was declared the winner as the certified vote. They sent both slates of electors to the Congress, and Richard Nixon, presiding over the Senate, like Mike Pence, serving in that function, declared that the real winner of Hawaii was John F. Kennedy. The reason I say it's not comparable is because in that case, the state had certified as the last resort.
But that's great. So I mean, I was hoping that you didn't know that. The fact that you know that is even more disingenuous then, because the issue with Donald Trump's slates of electors.
I'm going to explain to you why I cited that as the only example. I want to be clear. I don't agree with the legal theory that Mike.
But you just cited it, and you didn't explain it any further until I asked you.
Because you interrupted. Had you not interrupted,
no, you were done. You moved way past it. I let you move past it.
No. The relevance is that the reason why there were well-qualified actual members of the bar who had long been advising Donald Trump on a whole bunch of legal matters, had come up with this theory was because that was the one time in history after 1876 when the Electoral Act and the procedures were implemented when there was an actual dispute about which slate of electors should be chosen. And Richard Nixon, serving as the presiding officer of the Senate, was widely complimented because he actually acknowledged that the winner of Hawaii was not himself but was John Kennedy, implying that he had some discretion about which to choose. The reason I immediately said that it wasn't comparable, and it's the reason I never thought Mike Pence had the authority to do what Donald Trump believed he had the authority to do, was precisely because Richard Nixon was duty-bound to choose the actual certified winner of Hawaii, which is what he did. Nonetheless, he was complimented because he did have the ability to choose otherwise. If Mike Pence had done what Donald Trump had requested that he would do and that some lawyers told him Mike Pence had the duty to do, I have no doubt about what would have happened, which is that would have then gone to the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court whether or not Mike Pence in fact had the authority to do what he did. The Supreme Court would have ruled there was no inclination that the Supreme Court had to interfere and to make Donald Trump the presidency. They had the president. They had several opportunities to do and refrain. He would have lost in the Supreme Court, and he would have left office just as he did once he exhausted all of his appeals in the other two branches of government, and left peacefully on January 20th. The fact that Trump left peacefully on January 20th is, to me, the most dispositive fact. And it was a fact that will never change. It will always be true in history, and I think will make the attempts to depict what happened as part of the 2020 election as some sort of serious insurrection or serious attempted coup nothing short of laughable. Right now, there's a lot of people who hate Trump enough. They're willing to believe anything about him, but I think ultimately that's how it will be understood.
That's fine. I'm sorry, a failed coup is still a coup. Whether you leave afterwards because it failed it doesn't change the fact that the coup attempt was
to that level. I don't think it rises.
That's great, but you're literally willing to retroactively analyze whether Fort Sumter was an insurrection based on the events that came after. You would change that.
Let's not go over the old ground that we've already gone over.
I understand. The facts are hard. But hold on, just in response to what he said. So in response to what he said, I know you're upset. I know facts are hard. I know. I'm sorry. So the reason why I'm upset that you brought up 1960 and why I'm even more upset now that you know the details of it is because the issue was never that multiple slates of electors were sent, because state legislatures almost certainly have the ability to do that. The issue was that Hawaii sent two sets of electors because it was legitimately an incredibly close. I think it was off by like 140
votes.
Got
done explaining
I understand that you did, but the issue with what Trump did was they had electors in these 7 states falsely attest that they were authorized and duly elected by the state assemblies in order to send their electoral votes to Congress. That was a lie. It was perjury. They were encouraged to do it by people under Trump, and they did it on a bullshit legal theory from Eastman that everybody knew was bullshit. And they you can always find one crazy,
and not Sidney Powell.
That's great, and I'm sure I can find a doctor that'll tell me that acupuncture will cure my diabetes. Just because you have one person,
I don't agree with those lawyers. The point is, Trump had lawyers telling him it was a valid,
and he lost. Hold on. Let me finish my point. The issue is that these electors transmitted their votes to Congress falsely. They lied, and they were encouraged by Trump's campaign to lie. They were not authorized by the state assemblies like they were in Hawaii in 1960 to do so, which is why the comparison is insane. And by the time those electoral votes got to Congress, the plan from Trump, the plan from Eastman at that point, wasn't to say that Pence could declare a winner after the legitimate negotiations had happened in Congress over whether or not these electoral slates were real. The goal was to say, Pence was going to just say, hey, actually, I don't know where these came from. We're just going to go ahead and throw it to the assemblies in the House and let them decide, which Republicans had 26 and Democrats had 24 state assemblies, which would have meant that Donald Trump arguably could have won the election. This is undoubtedly a self-coup. Nobody thought this legal theory was valid. Even Eastman called it highly into question multiple times during some of the memos that he sent himself. And the only 3 lawyers that Trump took advice from, in opposition to his actual qualified lawyers, were Eastman, Giuliani, and Powell, who are so much clowns. Even people like Tucker Carlson were texting back and forth with Fox News execs saying how annoying it was that Sidney Powell was making claims that they had to carry on the network because everybody knew that she was full of shit.
Rudy Giuliani spent most of his adult life as one of the most revered revered lawyers and political figures in the United States, to the point where people thought when he ran for president in 2008 that he was deemed the front runner.
And then he gave a speech in front of the Four Seasons Landscaping Company.
I never thought so. I always have despised Giuliani. But the way the criminal law works is very often if a defendant is charged with some sort of criminal intent and they can prove that they had actual lawyers who were advising them that what they were doing was legal, that goes directly to their intent of whether or not they understood.
Dead wrong.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
You're dead wrong.
I've practiced law for so many years. If you can prove that you have lawyer letters telling you that what you've done is actually legal and is highly relevant in a court of law as to whether or not you had criminal intent, because people are expected to rely on the advice of their counsel to understand what the law is. I think Trump's theory, for the reason that I explained well before you took 10 minutes to do so, was baseless. But he thought it was valid because he had lawyers who were telling him that it was.
You're right. Okay. That's okay. Maybe you're right there. You're the lawyer and I'm not. Can you tell me what is it called if I do a thing with a lawyer where we both make a plan to break the law? What is that called, Glenn?
Oh, if you have lawyers who are giving not only deliberately false advice, but false advice that the client knows is false, just to create a fraudulent scheme that you had legal counsel, that then will of course be relevant to the question of whether or not that person had criminal intent. But in this case, these lawyers were not, again, these were not personal injury lawyers that he just pulled off the street and paid a bunch of money to write a letter that he told them to write. These were lawyers who had operated at the highest levels of the United States government, who had been regarded as highly prestigious lawyers who graduated.
But they're also indicted in some cases as co-conspirators. So if they're indicted as co-conspirators, you can't use the fact that they're giving you legal advice because you seek them out for that particular legal advice, trying to break the law. You can't use the excuse that their lawyers giving you advice. It is literally one of the key exceptions to attorney-client privilege, Glenn.
He had not been accused of that. They had not been accused of fraud.
They hadn't been accused of it when they were breaking the law. That's normally how breaking the law works. Yes, correct. Usually when you're in the process of breaking a law, you're not being accused currently of doing it.
Right.
But he was working at advice that was being...
At the time, if you look at it from Trump's perspective, which is what the law is required to do, to determine not whether he was wrong in the theory that he embraced, but whether or not he knew that it was illegal and pursued it anyway, the fact that he had not only various members of the bar, but 3 lawyers who had long been regarded as highly prestigious, who graduated some of the best law schools in the country, who, in the case of Rudy Giuliani, was one of the most revered public figures for decades in the United States. I believe he was Time Man of the Year once. He was as celebrated as you will ever find after 9/11. He had actual lawyers who were giving him this advice, writing legal memos about why Mike Pence had that theory. When Mike Pence concluded otherwise, Trump accepted his defeat and left the White House peacefully. He had resorted to all the legal recourses that he believed he had, that lawyers told him that he had, and when those were exhausted and he lost, he didn't order the military to keep him in power. He walked out of the White House peacefully.
So then what? So you're a fan of using one sentence to incriminate somebody or exonerate them. When Pence and Trump were talking, and Trump said, when Trump said, "Well, you said you're a fan of using one sentence to either exonerate or convict somebody," I guess, because when Trump said march peacefully, you think that's okay. So the peaceful thing completely exonerates Trump from the hour-minute rile-up that he did before the insurrection. That's fine. When Trump was talking to Pence and Trump said, "You're too honest, Mike," after asking for like the 50th time to decide the election on his own, what did Trump mean when he said that?
I have no idea if that's being conveyed accurately. I have no idea what Trump's intention was, but we have all kinds of evidence that Trump vehemently believed that the advice he was given by lawyers was advice that he found persuasive. It wasn't just whispered to him. It was conveyed to him in the form of legal memos of the kind that lawyers write all the time to lay out the arguments. And there were not just 3 lawyers in the United States.
Eastman literally thought that their little scheme... Eastman literally thought their scheme would get overturned at the Supreme Court. He knew it was bogus legal theory. He literally had said this, and they were just trying to buy time for their coup. That was the whole point.
Yes, exactly, because Trump believed that there was actual fraud in the election. He wanted more time to be able to find the proof of that fraud.
I agree. You're justifying the insurrection. He wanted to coup the government because he thought they stole it from him.
That's proof that it's not an insurrection. He knew it was going to end up at the Supreme Court. Had Mike Pence you keep trying to invent false histories.
No, you're giving like a mens rea for insurrection. He thought the election was stolen, therefore he could try to flip the election?
Mens rea is vital in every single criminal prosecution. If you don't have mens rea, you don't have a crime.
That's literally not true because strict liability crimes can be convicted with no mens rea, but okay.
Which are the tiny minority of prosecutions.
Sure, that's fine, but mens rea is not... just because you didn't know you're doing an insurrection doesn't save you from the fact of the matter of it being an insurrection and you being held to account for every single thing related to it.
These are empty arguments. This is just you.
We'll see when it goes to court, I guess.
Trump didn't know that it was an insurrection.
Wait, Glenn. I think we've gone around quite a bit. We've probably gone everything. What time do you want to finish? Because it's been around 2 hours.
Honestly, unless there's we haven't discussed the issue of what the FBI role is, although we did talk about the fact that the FBI had informants on the ground. I don't really need to go into Ray Epps, a thing I've never really been a fan of. I do think there's a question about why the FBI didn't know more, or if they did know more, but I feel like we debated that a lot in the first debate, which was 3+ hours. I feel like we're kind of at the end of the discussion. It's been just a little over 2 hours, so I'm fine in ending it here unless Destiny feels like there's some really pressing issue that we haven't covered.
No, I think this is... What do you think about the whole elector scheme?
I think Trump believed that there was an actual good faith reason to believe that there was fraud committed in the election. And he was told that if you submit various electors, that would buy them the time to find the proof that they hadn't yet found.
So you think that as long as Trump thought there was fraud, he was authorized to do basically whatever he wanted as long as he could find a lawyer that agreed with him?
No, I believe that entitled him to exhaust every legal recourse in the other two branches of government, which is what he actually did. And once those recourses were exhausted and he lost them all, as he did, his obligation was to do what he did, which was to walk peacefully out of the White House on January 20th as part of the peaceful transition of power to Joe Biden.
Do you think the fake electors were legal? Having people testify to being electors when they're not, you think that's okay because he thought that maybe there was election fraud? He could have those people lie about being the duly elected electors or appointed electors?
I mean, I contest that characterization, but I also think that it would have been
what do you contest
of what would have been that it would have been part of what would have been contested as part of the judiciary. All of this would have ended up in the courts. You want to create this false history about how if Mike Pence had done something that he didn't actually do, what Trump would have done. My belief is that Trump would have left the White House on January 20th, no matter how many other proceedings he ended up resorting to. There was the Supreme Court there, even though people were claiming that Amy Coney Barrett had only gotten this position because of a promise that she made to vote for Donald Trump in the election. None of that ever happened. In the real history, in the actual history, once Trump lost everything that he tried in the legal process, he left office peacefully. And that is the core fact. If he would have delayed, I believe defeats everything you say, it will never change.
Gotcha. So if he would have managed to delay the certification of the vote by, let's say, a month, because the Supreme Court case, they wanted to wait for whatever reason, and then they do the electoral investigation, they find out there's no fraud, and then he leaves peacefulully after staying in office longer than he should have for a few weeks, would that have been okay?
I mean, you're trying to create false histories.
That's literally what he was trying to do.
If Trump convinced the Congress that there was sufficient evidence of fraud, that a month was required to investigate the evidence of fraud that Congress believed had there, and they wanted to delay it by a month, and then Congress went back and certified the actual results of the election, and then Trump left peacefully on January 20th, my view would be the same. As long as Trump confined himself to appealing to the other two branches of government and did not try and use his command of the military or his command of the other armed parts of the government to keep himself in power, words like coup and insurrection are things that only MSNBC fans get excited about and believe. And I think it's the reason why Trump is leading in all the polls, because people obviously don't think that what Trump did rose to a level of criminality, even to keep him out of the White House, much less to put himself in jail.
And then when Trump told his Justice Department, when he told Clark to go and talk to, I think it was the acting AG Rosen and then the acting deputy AG Donahue, that you guys need to write a letter to the state saying we have all this evidence of election fraud, and that if they refused, Clark told Rosen that he'd basically be fired and he'd be made acting attorney general. And when that same scheme was brought up in the Oval Office, and I think half of the White House staff threatened to quit if Trump went through with it, do you think that any of that was improper? Asking his Department of Justice to lie to the states about election fraud?
if you believe, as I do, that Trump's contention that the 2020 election was pervaded with all sorts of fraud and that he was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election, asking his Justice Department to find that evidence and telling them that he would fire them if they refuse looks a lot different in its intent than if you begin with the assumption that you are beginning in, that Trump knew that he lost and that everything he was trying to do was an attempt illegally to stay in power. And as I've told you many times, that narrative that Trump was willing to do anything, even outside the law, as long as he could stay in power, is completely contradicted by not only the things that he did do, but by, more importantly, the things that he didn't do. And that you can try and create every alternative history that you want. It's very difficult to analyze hypotheticals like that where we don't have any context or any details for what happened. I can look at the events that happened in real life, and those culminated with Donald Trump not calling in the military, not trying to rile up the armed factions of the government as he could have done. Certainly, a lot of them would have been loyal to him. He could have caused a lot of violence, a lot of internal conflict, maybe even a civil war in order to stay in power. He did none of that, and he transferred power peacefully to Joe Biden in the way that has been done since the beginning of the Republic.
Do you think Donald Trump, does he bear any responsibility at all for what happened on January 6th?
I mean, he has responsibility, but not in a way that could ever be legal. I mean, he clearly riled up that crowd. He got people riled up. I mean, Rachel Maddow and Bernie Sanders once riled up one of their fans.
I'm not asking about Maddow or Bernie Sanders. I know we like to pivot. I'm just saying, do you think Trump at all, does he have any culpability?
The reason I'm going to bring up analogies, even though you interrupt me and tell me that I shouldn't, is
because you don't want to actually say something bad about Trump. Because you need to be partisan.
It tests whether or not you actually have any consistency. Or
I have all the consistency in the world.
Glenn, you mentioned that.
I think if he's going to if he wants to prolong this by asking me questions, I'm going to insist on the right to answer the questions in the way that I actually want. And if that means bringing up analogies or metaphors or
I can help with the analogies. If anybody else did the same thing that Trump did on J6, I'd say it's an insurrection.
I'm only going to. We're kind of like at the point where it's an interrogation. I'm kind of am flattered that Destiny seems not to want to. And so he's just kind of now asking me a bunch of questions, which I'm happy to engage in for a little bit longer, provided that I'm able to answer the questions without constantly being interrupted.
All right.
A lot of people have inspired other people to commit crimes. Rachel Maddow and Bernie Sanders, as I said, once got a Democrat, a liberal fan of theirs, so riled up in the belief that the Republicans were fascist and in bed with the Kremlin that one of them actually went in their names and shot up Republican congressmen to try and kill as many of them as he could, and almost killed Steve Scalise. So if you were to ask me, did Rachel Maddow and Bernie Sanders do anything to cause that person to go and do that, I would say yes, but not in a way that they bore any blame. They got people riled up, and sometimes if you get people riled up, some of them are going to go and commit crimes. The Supreme Court has said you can never be held liable for what other people do as a result of being inspired by your speech. So yeah, if you go around and constantly claim that the election results were the byproduct of fraud, I think it's predictable that some people might engage in violence. It's the kind of thing that you might even think, if it really happened, violence might even be justified. But I don't think that Donald Trump did anything illegal or anything that could be prosecuted, which is why, again, Jack Smith did not charge him with inciting an insurrection, because there's nothing in what Trump said that was anything other than constitutionally protected.
Well, so Destiny, I think what Glenn said is really what lies at your whole basis of the argument, was that Trump did not tell them exactly to go into the Capitol. But like what Glenn said, is he heated up the crowd. He did heat up the crowd, and he did talk about false election, which did incite them, although he didn't actually tell them to do that. That's what Glenn...
He told them to go peacefully. That's what he told them.
He also said to fight like how they're stealing your country.
But wait a second, Glenn, did he not just say he heated up the crowd?
Yeah, he heated up the crowd because... a lot of crowds you're allowed to heat up crowds. I've heated up crowds before by saying, oh, look, the NSA is spying on you in a way that's unconstitutional. Now, maybe some of those people might have been motivated to go to the NSA and try and plant a bomb because I heated them up. But it wouldn't mean that I was responsible. The only thing that Trump said about violence and whether it should be used on January 6th was, don't do it. Go to the Capitol and be peaceful. Obviously, they were agitated and riled up as a result of a political speech. That's what you want to do in a political speech. You want to agitate people and get them riled up about an injustice that you're there to speak about. That's what every good political speech does.
One final question. I'm so curious on this. For Trump legitimately thinking that there was voter fraud, legitimately thinking that the election was stolen. So despite the fact that all of his campaign people, I think Bill Stepien is field director, despite the fact that Chris Miller from intelligence agency, despite the fact that William Barr, his attorney general, despite the fact that all of these people that he trusted in his government, I think Pence and his team looked into it, everybody that he trusted to look into election fraud, they all said that it wasn't there, and he still said it was there. What would it take for you to be convinced that Donald Trump was knowingly repeating false claims about the election, and he was only repeating them so that he could stay in power? What would you need to actually prove his state of mind there?
First of all, you were the one who said earlier that the reason why Trump didn't order the military, the intelligence community, to act to protect him is because they were essentially trying to subvert him. You even said that he was basically alone, that no one was on his side in the government, that even the people surrounding him in the military intelligence community didn't actually trust him. So I'm not surprised that he didn't find those arguments or their conclusions persuasive, because he understood that a lot of people in government were there to subvert him. But as Darren Beatty said to you, who worked in the Trump White House and knows a lot of people who knows Trump well and who himself knows Trump well, I don't think there's a single person who knows Trump well who doubts that Trump actually believed that there was fraud in the election. Now, maybe that's because he's so psychologically invested in his ego that he actually can't believe that he would have actually lost an election. Maybe it's because he had really become convinced that the entire American establishment was so corruptly aligned against him and willing to do anything and everything to remove him from power. Maybe it's because Democrats have cheated before in elections, like I said, in 1960. There's probably other times as well.
Because
I don't
they
really
cheated
know.
in
I can't
1960,
prove to you,
the Hawaii thing?
I wasn't around then, but there's a lot of historians who believe that the Daley machine in Chicago,
the Chicago
got
part,
John Kennedy the election in Illinois. I mean, sure. I'm not saying I believe that, but that is something that
let's say that what you're saying is true, that he didn't trust any of these people. Wasn't the reason why he didn't trust them because he asked them to find election fraud and they said no? Doesn't that show that
he had started to trusting them previously? There were people close to him.
Then why did he trust them to investigate election fraud?
Who were telling him that they had proof that there was fraud in the election. There were a lot of people who were making that argument both publicly and privately to him.
But without any evidence.
If you know anything about Donald Trump, that his inability to believe that he actually lost, that the American people had actually rejected him, and that the Democrats and the U.S. security state and the deep state, something he had spent years complaining about, and that you yourself even said were in fact aligned against him, the fact that Donald Trump would actually, under those circumstances, come to conclude that he didn't really lose, but in fact was the victim of fraud, is something that is very easy for me to believe was true. And I think what Darren Beatty said is right on, that almost every person who knows Trump that I've ever talked to, even ones who believe that the election fraud claims are bullshit, were convinced that he was authentic in his belief that that election was stolen.
So what evidence would it take to show you otherwise, to convince you otherwise?
I mean, ultimately, there's no proof one way or the other about what's going on in somebody's brain. All we can use is circumstantial evidence.
Correct. So I'm asking what circumstantial evidence, yes.
Yeah, I think that the fact that there were people telling him in his ear that he did not actually lose the election, the way in which he's psychologically constituted, the way that he is talked so many times about both the Democratic Party and the U.S. establishment, the fact that he maintains to this very day that the election was stolen, even though that a majority of Americans don't actually agree with him on this, the lengths to which he went, the way in which he argues it, the fact that a lot of people believe in the Republican Party, in fact, I think a majority, that there was actually election fraud, all to me point to the fact that when you put that together with Trump's psychological incentives to believe that he didn't really lose, it's far more likely than not that he truly was convinced that there was sufficient fraud in the election that made him the legitimate winner.
So there's no piece of evidence, because everything you're saying is also consistent with him just wanting to stay in power.
There's no such thing as dispositive proof when it comes to understanding what's in somebody's brain. It's
okay, I don't know why you keep saying that. How do we get convictions where mens rea is an essential part of the crime? Like for first-degree murder, we have to know that you intended to murder somebody, which is manslaughter, right? Glenn, we read people's states of mind all the time for criminal court.
I'm realizing now that you don't understand the difference between evidence and proof. Proof is something that is dispositive. So if someone steals something and they're caught on a videotape stealing it, then you have dispositive proof that they've done so. Usually in criminal cases, there's not proof, there's evidence, and the evidence is often conflicting, and a jury has to decide how to resolve that conflicting evidence. And that's why in a civil trial, they're told they have to believe just 51% or more in order to reach a verdict, whereas in a criminal trial, they have to believe beyond all reasonable doubt. But the way that works is you present evidence of intent. There's very rarely proof of intent, which is the thing that you're looking for.
When I'm asking you for...
You don't have it either.
Yeah, you're right. You cannot prove 100%. That's true.
Exactly.
What I'm asking is, what is the types of evidence that would move you over into thinking, oh, he was probably just trying to hold on to power? Oh, and actually, I think I did say evidence, by the way. But what is the evidence that would convince you that, oh, there's not one piece of dispositive thing, not a written confession or a travel to the past?
If Trump had said to people who convincingly relate it, oh, you know what, I actually think I really lost this election.
So you need a confession.
No way I'm going to let my... No, you're asking me for examples of things that I would find convincing, and I'm giving those to you.
Besides a confession, obviously.
Well, that's one good way. Another good way is if he had nobody around him who was believing or arguing that there was evidence of fraud, that he was just kind of, as you were trying to claim I was, on an island all by myself. If he had actually nobody that he was around him or that he trusted telling him that there was proof of fraud or strong evidence of fraud, even though you had Rudy Giuliani and other people telling him that they strongly believed there was, I think that would add to the belief, to the credible case that Trump was saying there was fraud, even though he really didn't believe it. None of those things actually happened, though. None of those things is true. And so you're asking me to say what my belief is based on the body of evidence that I have, all of which I've described for you and laid out in great detail over the last 5 minutes, that leads me to believe very strongly, while recognizing there's no proof, that Trump believed the election was fraudulent.
So to be clear,
can you just do your final point here? Because I feel like we're just going around.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm good. I'll just respond to that final point. I don't have any more questions. To be clear, you haven't laid out any strong evidence showing that Donald Trump sincerely believes, other than this idea. Other than this idea, I'm not declaring myself. Other than this idea that Trump has this, that Trump has this psychotic attention. Well, the American vote is going to decide. The Supreme Court is going to decide. All sorts of people are going to be deciding a whole bunch of things. But this idea,
we should participate in the debate. But this need that you have to constantly say, "I'm on an island. Nobody agrees with me. You're right. I have no evidence." Just let people watch the debate.
They can do it, but I think it's important to call out.
Understand that
you have not laid out any factually compelling arguments. Nothing that you say is factual.
Okay, well,
I have. I can point to exact things. For instance, that Raffensperger call that you brought up earlier. Whoa, what was he looking for? 11,000 votes. I know you don't want to debate on the facts. You want to talk about the fact that they're partisan and the courts were Democrats. And Pelosi was the first one to put together a partisan body.
I'm done. This is not interesting or helpful. I'm above this.
Thanks, Glenn.
Glenn, Bethany, I think that's the best time to finish off. Thanks both for responding. Actually, it was around half an hour ago. I think it was actually around 34 minutes ago. I wrote down the time because you actually both agreed with each other. So I was very proud of that moment 34 minutes ago. But aside from that, I think overall it was good debate. There was some heated moments. And thank you both for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Destiny, for doing it. Thank you, Eli, for moderating. You did a great job.
No, thank you. No problem. Thanks so much.
All right, good night.